Testing. Yeah.
Good afternoon. A quick word of welcome. I'm Kelly Batten, and I'm chair of church council. Stand here in the middle for those who are viewing us online, and then to our in-person audience. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today. With me today, my wife Melissa, and more recently, we've been enjoying participating with the University United Methodist Church family at Kindred Church, and certainly would enjoy anytime any of you want to join us, 10 o'clock, AMC, Martin Luther King Boulevard. So it is a pleasure that we're here today to be in service together for a town hall, and we look forward to your participation, whether online or in person, throughout this year. Now that I have fully recovered from the Carolina-Duke basketball result, I'd like to offer a brief word of prayer just to center us before we begin. If you join me in prayer. Lord, calm our minds, open our hearts, place your hand on our shoulder for peace and comfort, so that we may listen, learn, and lead as your church in Christ's love. Amen. Pastor Jameson.
Well, thank you, everyone, for coming. I am filling in for a very important role. I'm going to do my best Mike Saunders impression for you today, so please contact him and let him know how I did. I've been working on his vocal cadence. Mike is irreplaceable, and yet today here I stand to go over some of the numbers that I passed out. So some of you have been diligently, I even saw some folks with your calculators on your phones. Thank you so much. I appreciate that when someone's handed a piece of paper, you actually look at it. That's helpful. If you didn't grab one, they're right up here on the front, on my right, your left. We're about to have them modeled, our very own. There you go. Does anyone else need one? I'll try to catch everyone. All right. So what I want to do is I'm going to break this up into a couple sections with time to pause for questions. So in each section, as you have questions you want to ask, please hold those, and then I'll break to ask for them. And at the end, I'll make sure that we're all have clarity. So this is a giving update specifically focused on our giving for this fiscal year, our fiscal year through January. Now, one thing to remember for those who may not know this, or it sometimes can kind of be hard in your brain, I myself, as a lifelong accountant, have to still do this. We, several years ago, opted to move our fiscal year off of the calendar year. So we are July through June. So though it may not feel like it for you as tax season is here, this is technically our halfway mark, a little bit over our halfway mark. And so when we talk about giving, we're often going to be talking about the kind of giving that happens for those who participate in the life of the church, which is often for you going to be a January to December, but our fiscal year is from July to June. And a couple of the reasons why is that by shifting it kind of off of those two things lining up, it means we're allowed to then have conversations like this in the middle of our year, as opposed to the old days, if you've ever been on finance, when you hit November, December, and your year's about to end, and that's the year. And Justin's nodding his head because he's been a part of some of those meetings, and I have, and some of you maybe have served on the committees here for that. So this actually was a strategy of ours to say, okay, how can we respond to kind of the study of the generosity of our congregation and make appropriate changes and still have time to do that, which is why we did that. That being said, as you can look, there are two sides to this sheet. The right side kind of has some helpful information just about our endowment. Folks have asked about its size and scale, and I won't cover as much about the endowment today, but I'd be happy to take any questions. But you can kind of see that. You'll see that our normal pattern is to have a vote and take 5% of all endowment funds and apply that to either the designated activities those funds have been given for, or the general operating budget. We are currently working on reforming our endowment committee, but those are all pre-assigned based on how that gift is received by the church, and so that's kind of preset, but 5% is very normal. Because you may have that question, why are we pulling out 5%? That's just what we happen to do almost every year. So looking at the columns on the left, this is going to be our first section. So I'm going to do my best to walk us through this, and as you have questions, I hold those, and at the end I'm going to try to answer them. And I promise if I can't give you an answer because I need something that's either in our database or that Mike may need to know, I promise I will write those down and I will follow up with some follow-up comments after this. I want to make sure we have all the clarity we can. So one of the things that we look at is we like to look at rolling averages on a couple of different ways as far as looking at a whole year, looking at how individual months stack up to individual months, and then looking how year-to-date stacks up to year-to-date. So if you're looking at all those dates and your eyes are kind of glazing over, just think about the categories. One is a whole year, which means, running years are from now until last year. One is year-to-date, which would be from, last year's July to January, and we're comparing it to this year's July to January. And then the obvious one is the one about how did January do compared to last January. And we look at those three. Why? Well, the reason we do that is because giving, while we can plan and monitor it, we realize that while folks are consistently generous throughout the year, they're not consistently generous in when they give during the year. Some folks are more than not, but for a lot of people, and it makes sense, I don't think a lot of you are thinking that February and maybe May are that different if you give a gift because you gave it in the same calendar year. That's awesome. But for us, trying to track it, we want to look at these three ways so we don't see a sudden, let's say, dip in February and we think, oh my gosh, what does that mean? No, we look at the whole year and say, no, we're fine. So that's kind of why we track it. So the trend for January, as you can see, we'll start with that one, was fairly positive. We had a very strong start to the year. But as you can see, giving year-to-date and giving over the last year, there is a decrease. For giving over the whole year is 1.8%, and I'll be rounding just a little bit. And for the fiscal year, so this is July to January compared to July to January, is 4.3. Now, the reason I want to pause here is to explain a little bit about our analysis. Mike and I, in consultation with Pastor Justin, have been working on this, trying to understand why we are where we are. I think a couple of things that we've seen as we've studied the information has to do with how pledges were completed going through the end of the year. We had a higher than normal amount of pledges that were not fulfilled. And I want to be very clear here because this is my yearly reminder that we are not the mob. We do not show up at people's houses to shake you down for protection money because we say you owe us. Any time that we talk about pledging, I consider this a pastoral care moment. Not only just generosity, how we need that to know how we plan, but also we know stuff happens over the course of a year. We know that illnesses happen, layoffs happen, income changes, and for us in this last year, we definitely think that a lot of our pledges were affected by the stock market. You can't look at a 20% decrease as a conservative average and not think that's not going to affect. And what we know is that for folks that give month to month, they tend to not be a more one-time giver. They're less affected by the stock market than for some of us who may be retired or giving from sizable assets, because that's just a different thing. Your paycheck tends to stay more consistent month to month, but if there's a 20% decrease in the stock market, you may be thinking, I'm still giving, but perhaps I'm not able to give at the level I thought at the start of the year. So I want to say 100% that whatever you give us is wonderful. So here and online, I want to say that clearly, and because I think sometimes when we talk about numbers, it can hit us in the heart. And this is not here for us to rally the wagons to talk about, which sinners didn't turn in enough to abide by Jesus. That's not who we are. But we do need to say that we have seen less received than we anticipated. And so what are we going to do about that? Well, in a rough kind of number, we kind of got about $80,000 less than we thought in November and December. Now, it's very rough, and we're still trying to clean that up, but we anticipated that we'd have about $80,000 more than we would have normally received in November and December. Why is that important? Well, you may not know this, but the highest 80,000. Good clarity. Yes, when we're talking numbers, if you don't understand a number I say, raise your hand. That's a great, so I'm gonna break my own rule. That's a great question to ask immediately. No, don't wait till the end. You may not know this, but November, December tend to act like super months. They can sometimes count for about 3 to 4 months worth of giving in those 2 months because of how people give. Because again, for a lot of folks, your end of year is going to be November, December, whereas our church year, that's the middle. And so what are the things that we're doing? Well, before I say that, I want to pause here. That's a lot of financial stuff just to throw at you. So what questions do we have immediately? And then I'll go into talking about some of our strategies for how we think we're going to accomplish the 4.3% reduction. Yes?
You've given us numbers about income, but nothing about the budget or how this income compares to expenditures or how we're doing on the budget so far.
Sure. So that's a good point. I would say that the question was, for those who may not be able to hear, is what about the budget as far as total expenditures? I would say this church tends to set a budget pretty close to what it intends to raise, meaning that our income is anticipated to be what we spend. It's a break-even budget. And what we're really monitoring now, because we can kind of control expenses, is that we just want to focus on the giving in this context. And I will say, for instance, if anyone would like the total budget, we're as a nonprofit, we will provide that to you if you want to see the expenses. But I think for the clarity of our conversation today, focusing on the giving numbers is helpful for us because that shows us where we need to be to meet the kind of goals with the budget that we want to meet. I do understand how not having all of that information, I could see how that could allow us to have a different kind of conversation, but I think specifically for today, we really wanted to focus on the giving aspect because that's what the finance committee, as we talk, is really committing to for the next 4.5 months, 5 months, is focusing on how do we continue to give as strongly as we have, and in the areas of which there may not be the same kind of giving, how do we adjust and make adjustments? What other questions do you have? How do I define giver? That's a great. So I think what I'll do, pass it around, and also I will always reframe. So someone's asking, how do we define a giving unit? That's a great question. One of the things that has changed in the last 10 to 15 years in church giving is that no longer is the church just dependent on what I would call the normal giver, which is a pledge. 50, 60 years ago, you would do a generosity campaign, you would get pledges, and that would be the budget. What we see now is that most churches have some variance. So if your total amount is $100 you want to raise, it's not uncommon to say 80% of that will be pledged, but $20 will be unpledged. And so what we look at are really 3 categories of folks. One is people that pledge. The old classic, because that's a commitment that you've said, I'm going to support the church in this way. We do our best to say you can sign up monthly to give or one-time gifts, but we follow that. The second, and this is what we're working on getting a better view around, is anyone that has given regularly across the years. So they may not give us a specific amount, but we know this, and I talk about family units because it can be a family of 1 or a family of 30, but this family has given us this amount. And also in that category, which is the new trend, people that look like me, who are younger and give, they tend to pledge monthly more regularly without actually filling out a pledge, if that makes sense. So if you have a normal family under the age of 40 that joins, they will sign up for monthly giving a lot more quickly than they will give you a pledge to say they're signing up. So we're actually getting history now on how those folks give. So we can kind of create a category that's not a pledge card, but is a pretty consistent amount. Because people that tend to give monthly tend to give throughout the year, as opposed to if you give one time a year and you reach the end of the year, that's a lot to make up in a category if you can. And then the third is what I call spontaneous giving. This is the trickiest. These would be folks that often have a connection to the church. Maybe they grew up here, but they're going to give every 1 to 3 years. And so every church I've been at has these folks where they have fond memories of this place. Perhaps they have loved ones that are in our memorial garden. So every 2 to 3 years, they're going to give you some amount of money. And so we have to try to factor into our own analysis, how much do we count on that year to year? Because yes, they've given like that over the last decade, but you know, the further you get away from that personal connection with an organization, the easier it is to not make that commitment. So you have pledge giving, you have consistent unpledged giving, and then you have what I call sporadic gifts. Does that kind of get at your question? Yes, yes.
Jameson, my question slash comment is about both UUMC and Kindred. Are you going to speak to Kindred, in which case I'll wait, or I can say it now?
Yes, I was going to plan to speak to that in just a second. Yeah. The reason I'm pausing is because Kindred is a subset within. It's not included. Like when you look at these numbers, the year-to-date giving does not include. For like the month of January, doesn't include Kindred. Kindred is a line that we add together. That's the total money we've. Okay.
So here's my comment. You already pointed out on the left.
Hold on 1 second.
Just a second.
Jim,
just a second.
hold on one second. Let me give you this mic.
The top group of numbers show that UUMC, 12-month period ending January 31st this year, is 26,000 less than the previous 12 months, down 1.88%. But looking halfway down the page, Kindred is up, roughly 70,000. If you combine those, UUMC plus Kindred, we're up 42,000. 12-month period ending January 31st is 42,000 more. That's about 2.5% more. And to me, in some way, that's a more relevant number than just looking at UUMC without also considering Kindred.
Sure. So one of the things that's helpful here, and I want to be careful because we're going to move into a conversation where I don't have numbers to give you. And so because I don't have that, I want to be careful how much specificity I add. Essentially, Kindred is a growing community within our operating budget that we're also tracking separately than how we track the operating budget of University United Methodist Church. Now, we are the University family of churches, and one of the most complicated things you do when you're a family of churches, I would also encourage you to go worship across the family, but in-house, you have to be careful about how do you track income streams against expenses for the buckets that they're in. And so what I'm trying to point out is we're trying to isolate kind of university giving against what we need university giving to be, because as Kindred is growing, they're not currently 100% self-sufficient. And so what we don't do is we don't play the game of trying to understand, well, if they're this much below, we're all one bucket together, but for our in-house purposes for today's meeting, we're trying to talk about the giving for university specifically. Does that help without going into specific details? Okay, I am going to pause here because I don't want to talk numbers out loud. So what I will commit to is I will respond to your question in writing and make it available to the group, just because I understand what you're saying, and I don't have a dry erase. Anyways, before we go down that, I will. So the question on the floor is, how does Kindred Giving interact with UMC Giving, and what does that mean for our overall deficit? And what I can do is provide you a question of clarity and a response to that.
Right. And if I could just say, just in a general way, when you look at the overall numbers here, if you were not thinking about budget, it is good. We do see growth. So net growth in dollars year over year. And though we've been subsidizing Kindred, so it's not fully self-sustaining, every year there has to be less of that subsidy. So we do see Kindred growing along a measure that we expected, and that's really good. So all of that is positive. Part of what Jameson is talking about now in our overall budget, mostly related to the university campuses, the projected budget, which was an increase year over year, and the delta that we're facing there year over year. I mean, that is part of the challenge that Jameson's trying to tease out. I do want to make a comment related to Bob's question earlier as well. So what Jameson said is correct. We tend to budget. Our budget is very much in line with our projections. And so, as you all know, people don't give evenly across a year. Therefore, you expect for month to month for there to be a certain kind of padding so that you can account for the leaner months of giving. Really what's happened here is mid-year, also mid-year is the time when we have large apportionment payments and things like that to the annual conference. Here, because of the $80,000 difference that we're projecting, it's becoming month to month a little bit tighter. So you expect to have there to be some cash on hand especially for unexpected things. Well, that margin is very tight now. And so we are trying to, and Jameson will talk about the strategies here in a bit, but so how do we, what changes can we make between now and end of fiscal year to make sure that we don't find ourselves in a challenged place? And then as we look toward the coming fiscal year, how can we make adjustments if these projections continue to carry forward?
That's perfect.
Yeah.
And what I will say,
But we've got a couple questions here, I think. I'm trying to remember who was first. Okay, geek question.
I have a finance geek question. Did you say we had switched fiscal year from calendar year to academic year?
that is correct,
And
essentially.
when did we do that?
I knew you were going to ask me. Before I came, can I go to there? I want to say it was 2020. Maybe
So in
2021.
December 2020 was the last calendar year
I can find that out for
budget?
you.
It would, because actually when you're looking at numbers by mid-year versus one year to another.
Well, what I will say is we changed it long enough ago where these will fall, but that's a good question. These will fall in the normal range. Yes.
So my question was more at getting at trying to understand the reason for the shortfall and whether it's attributable to people that were historically giving to UMC, giving now to Kindred. Have we done an analysis to see if the additional amount that's been coming up in Kindred over what's projected is actually sort of moving from UMC to Kindred, or is it truly just loss in giving overall?
Right. So our what is the way to explain this? So the question is, how has Kindred giving affected UMC giving? An easy thought would be, we planted this new community. That's great. Often when you plant a new extension of your church, folks from the existing church go over there. That attracts certain folks. And so how does that influence our giving from UMC? I will say, without driving into the exact numbers, it is some, But we're now at the point where most of Kindred's increased giving is their own recruitment and folks there. And while that transition hasn't happened, we have been primarily been able to identify pledging and giving from membership who are still most active on Franklin Street, is the way I would describe that. So to Mike and I's trained eye, while there could be some, in the year we're in now, it was definitely more when it first started, but in the year we're in now, it's more negligible. And that's not one of the primary, while that could be a factor, we don't view it as a primary factor. Does that kind of get at what you're saying? And there's numbers about that, and we could dive into the details. That's a really good question.
It's a small number of families that have, for a while, were doing giving in both places, but now have migrated over. When we look at the givers that Jameson has primarily been talking about, what we see is not even, other than in the case of death, but for the most part, what we see is not anyone ceasing to give, but it's more a lower number of not completing the pledge. And interestingly enough, in many of those cases where families did not complete the pledge for the coming fiscal year is the same. So, so we're again still trying to understand what this phenomena is, but we think that it's attributable to some of the things Jameson talked about before.
And one of the reasons I wanted to talk about Kindred right after this, so I'll just jump into it. I have had the privilege of working in a lot of church plant situations. One of the great opportunities of me coming here, I think, that the church leadership felt like I might be a good staff member, was my experience back home in the Texas conference. And what I want to say about Kindred's giving is that it is astronomically good for a young church community. And now I'm not trying to put any weight on Daniel to keep this going the next 3 years, but its growth and development, not just of givers that were already here, but of new people in the community, has been really, really good. So to Justin's point, we want to keep closing that delta, and that delta has been closed every year. And that's something that finance and as we budget, we keep working on. But I wanted to specifically highlight Kindred that is an overwhelming success of our church. And we don't believe that it's really tying into the challenge and opportunity we have here on Franklin Street. And I know you may be wondering why you overemphasizing that, because there's no need for us to look to that as a reason why this is the reason it's happening. And that can be, because my brain would go there. That's a great question to ask. So I'm hoping, not that I can kind of nip it in the bud, sounds too strong, but just you can hear from us. We've considered that, we've evaluated that, and we're so thankful for what Kindred is doing. But that still leaves us with some work to do in Franklin that's independent of them. It's dangerous to say was that not verbose for a clergy person, but I tried my best to keep that consolidated. A couple more questions about the giving.
I want to make sure I'm understanding you. If Kindred's growth in giving has exceeded your expectations, then apparently UUMC is subsidizing them less than we had anticipated subsidizing them. Is that correct?
From an expense, there is a trajectory of how that delta should close.
Sure.
I think it's fair to say it is closing more quickly than I hate to say what we anticipate because I don't know what people anticipated, but it's moving at a great rate, is what I would say.
For budgeting purposes, obviously you had to anticipate some sort of subsidy.
Yes.
And if Kindred is coming along faster than we had even hoped, then my guess is that subsidy has to have been reduced somewhat, which is good for UUMC and also good for Kindred.
That's perfect. Yes. Yeah, and that's what, again, I'll never get tired of saying this. I'll say it all the time. I think the relationships we're developing with Kindred and Amity and Franklin Street are really healthy and wonderful, and they're really boons to the church. But to Justin's point, and I do appreciate the sensitivity because we do have some folks, as we know over the last year, that have passed away, and that's one of the reasons that pledges weren't completed. So when we talk about the strategies to meet this, one is a high focus on individual follow-up. Literally going down the lists, Pastor Justin, myself, and Mike have done this, and looking at who are these folks, what do we know about them, is this an opportunity? I said a couple of them we found out about health-related stuff. And that gives us a chance to be pastors in a church, because that's who we are first, and let's connect with them. The second is we had some folks transition to a different stage of income and living, which makes sense. For some folks, there seemed to just be, we forgot. And so there's two ways to take that. One way is, well, what do you mean you forgot? Well, we sent this to you. The other way, and this is the thing I really want to pat finance on the back. They took that as say, well, if someone told us that they forgot, then what are we doing about communicating regularly throughout the year? So we're not only are we following up more individually with folks who pledged last year and maybe didn't complete their pledge, we're taking it seriously for this calendar year. How do we communicate with everyone that's pledged on a regular basis to let them know, again, this is not a bill due. This is an opportunity for you to partner with us in ministry, and we want to get this out in front of you, because at the end of the day, we never want to get to a point where the only reason that someone didn't complete a pledge is because the church wasn't doing everything it could to connect with them to let them know, hey, you can still turn this in. And then the other kind of aspect is looking at ways in which we can do what we're calling donor care or just appreciation. You know, I think one of the things that has happened, and this church has a history of it, but we want to definitely bring it back, is communication like this. So the town hall, congratulations, you are participating in one of our stratagems for combating the pledge. Just by being here, you're blessing us with your conversation and questions to get this information out. But we want to put more information out in front of you. And so our idea is to have at least 3 town halls a year. At the end of this, I'll talk about that. And we'll do something a little special around November and December because of the holiday Advent season. But the other thing is to have regular events where we just thank you guys for what you do and how you participate in the life of the church. And finance has developed a whole subcommittee that's currently working on that to try to figure out how do we appreciate folks who see university as a place that's worth their time and investment, but not only that, but they feel a deep connection with. And you know, we are God believers. It is the Creed series, right? And so we want to try to connect with them on a regular basis.
I hope I'm not jumping the gun. I think you've covered your reasoning for why you think this has happened.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to take a deep breath and say, have you considered dissatisfaction with what's going on at church?
Yeah, that's always one of the considerations. Yes.
But you've rejected it?
No, I don't. No. So the question is, in our criteria of why people perhaps are not giving the way they do, I have not rejected it. I would say that's part of our individual follow-up and trying to connect with people to understand how and why they're giving. And I know that for all of us, there are things that really matter to us in the life of the church. And when those change, and let's face it, even in the best circumstances, the pandemic and the staff transition and turnover, I don't know if you've noticed, outside of Justin, a lot of new faces up here in the clergy ranks. Thankfully we have Tim Baker and Pastor Justin up here to provide some consistency in the chancel. That can create a lot of change and transition, and we've obviously we've changed the worship schedule, and Sunday school has looked different, and some programming during the week. And so what I want to say is, in this venue, it's probably hard to go into every specific opportunity, but I want to say that's definitely on the short list. You know, I would assume, maybe this is a better way to say it, if someone has not passed away, doesn't have a health condition, and they're still feeling dissatisfied or detached, that there's going to be an opportunity for a conversation about what is their experience in the life of the church. And I love Pastor Justin's leadership on this. Our job and calling, I'll say that, is that we want to be compassionate and listen and do everything we can to do what we can to help people feel connected. Now, it's always helpful to say that I can't guarantee what that looks like, but I can guarantee that we'll try, and we'll be a part of that. All right. So that's the first big chunk. That's our strategy for what we're going to do. That's really the giving and financial update, or as much as I think that we can tackle with information I have. Again, one of the feedback points that would be helpful to us is as we start town halls and we try to get better with what financial information would be helpful to you, don't hesitate to drop me or Mike an email or a comment and let us know, hey, the next time you talk, don't just talk about the giving. Is there a way we could have expenses This is not, I promise, Moses did not bring this report down from the mountain, and so we are willing to edit it. We just wanted to have a starting place. And so as we keep meeting regularly throughout the year, we can keep modifying this to be as useful as we can. The last kind of comment I'll make, and that's for all of you here, is we obviously are in a season in which we're doing all this follow-up and we're trying to connect with people and we're trying to understand our giving patterns. But we have the same ask that we always do, which is if you feel called, convicted, or able to either accelerate your pledge for this calendar year to pay into this fiscal year for us, we would welcome that. Or if you'd like to have a conversation with us about what would an extra amount of giving look like, because one of the things that, and I'm realizing I forgot to mention this earlier about the budget, is sometimes people are curious, and in these seasons when we're trying to work on giving, they kind of wonder, if I give $1 on the offering plate, where does that go? And you always see the classic diagrams, right, of like every dollar is broken up into 37 categories. So thank you for your 0.0%. Let's supply the TP for the upstairs bathroom, right? That's great. You feel great about that. For some folks, they actually like to give in a way where they can feel a tie to their offering. And so they may actually, even though they're designated inside the operating budget, they may say, I want this to go towards a specific ministry or activity, children's, music, choir, a mission. And so that counts in our budget, but we make sure it's directed that way. And I want to say that's all normal practice for every church I've been in, but that's been a question I have is, if I give like this, does it go to where? And the answer is yes. If you put it in the general operating budget, it goes in the general bucket. If you give for anything else, we make sure that it's applied in that way, because not just because we're required by law, but because we believe in that we are stewards of your generosity, and we want to apply that in the right ways. So I really appreciate your listening. You may be telling me that you were a captive audience and you had to listen, but you didn't look miserable during it, at least that I could tell with the sun in my eyes. So thank you guys very much. I'm going to stay afterwards for any more fiscal or financial geek questions. Don't worry about that. I will talk shop all day, but I'm going to turn it over to Justin to talk to us a little bit more about life and ministry in the church.
Thank you, Pastor Jameson. Appreciate it. Let me just say one more thing about your comment, Jerry, just about people in the church and dissatisfaction. I mean, as you all know, a church is filled at any given point with an abundance of satisfaction and an abundance of dissatisfaction. Another way to say that is there are numerous wheels that turn in the life of the church, some of which are always squeaking. So it is a challenge of a leader, I think, in any institution to not only chase all the squeaks, because as I've reminded the staff, when we accentuate something or some area of ministry that some group of our constituency loves, in every instance, someone else doesn't love it. And it's always this balancing act, all the time. And it's always on my mind. What people love is always on my mind. What people don't love is always on my mind. What people hope for is always on my mind, always in my prayers. I've gotten to the point in ministry where I try not to lose a lot of sleep, but I do try to commend a lot of prayer. And so, we're always going to be working on balancing those things and looking on our congregation and all of our needs with a sense of, as Pastor Jameson said, compassion, and figuring out what can reasonably be done to embrace the largest cross-section. And we all know as a family that we, at any given point, will, some of the experience we'll enjoy and a certain percentage we won't. But that's family life. And I tend to think that here at University Church, we do family life fairly well together. And so, yes, always a part of consideration. So I want to do kind of a highlight reel of things that we've talked about at Church Council and things we want to be focusing on here in the next little more than a year. I'll start with mission because that's what we're about, being in mission together. We are ever trying to find ways to increase our generosity in mission together. This is a generosity of time and gifts. And we're so excited to have Pastor Lindsay with us, who already in mere weeks has found ways to engage people in ministry and find new opportunities for people to engage in ministry, and is just always bringing up new ways that we can be in mission together. And so we've got lots to celebrate for Pastor Lindsay being here, but I think we'll have lots to celebrate in the months to come. It's a wonderful gift we have in her leadership. So we hope to grow in this area. One of those places, as you heard last week, may have heard last week, is in our church's Lenten support of the Weaver's Grove development for Habitat for Humanity, hoping to raise across 3 years here at our church $50,000 to go toward a $250,000 goal for several of our religious communities here in Chapel Hill to help build part of the community center there at Weaver's Grove. Really excited about it. We received within the worship service last week, a family made a $15,000 pledge toward it, toward that overall goal, $5,000 each year. And so we're kind of well on our way of moving toward that $50,000 goal. And so again, that's just the more ways that we can pour into our local community and make a difference. I just think that's what church is about, and I'm very thankful for the capacities of our church to do that. So hopefully we'll be seeing more and more of that. We, as a church council a few years ago, determined that a chief area of missional growth that we wanted to see, or a difference that we hope to make in our community, is working with our local school district to close the achievement and the opportunity gaps in the local school system. And so as many ways as we can find to do that, for black and brown students in our area, we will, and we're going to partner in whatever ways we can with our local district, and we're thankful for Dr. Hamlet and others in the school district that are excited to be our partners in that regard. Another thing, as we look beyond the walls of the church, but also within United Methodism, is we know that United Methodism is changing. And it's changing in our conference. 249 churches disaffiliated at the turn of the year. This represents 33% of our churches, and it represents 22%. Those churches represent about 22% of our membership. Now, these numbers are, we know that churches don't all disaffiliate and everyone in the church disaffiliates. Some people remain UMC, but rough numbers, about 22% of our membership in that way. So United Methodism is changing here and across our country, and people tend to look at churches like University Church, larger churches and conferences, to help lead in the midst of this, to help determine what United Methodism looks like locally moving forward. And we want to inhabit that role of servant leadership. If the bishop cabinet calls on us to be creative in how we think about ministry locally, to encourage other local churches in our area or in our conference, to when the conference establishes an initiative, to stand up and say, hey, yeah, we're going to try to be the poster children for that, the best of our ability is consistent with our life and mission here. So we're going to try to do that. I don't have any specifics on that. I just want to name that in this changing environment, we really have an opportunity as United Methodism is being redefined in some ways for when people look for the exemplars of the definition, they tend to look at a lot of the larger congregations. And so we want to be mindful of that and again be servant leaders in the midst of our conference and in the midst of our area. This may bring up some questions around General Conference. I know this will start. General Conference will be next year in 2024, and so we're already planning that as we begin to conclude 2023, so the end of this year, then moving into the beginning of next year, we'll share any relevant information around our much delayed General Conference that was supposed to be in 2020. It'll be in 2024. But we'll share whatever relevant information comes up as we draw closer to that. I don't have any right now, but do know that we're consciously going to be communicating all UMC news as we move into 2024. So let me bring it back into the life of our congregation with a few more comments. Last year, last August, moving into September, the church council began to say, all right, as we look at 2030, in our family of churches, and particularly in this campus of our family of churches, what are some of the things we really need to start working on now so that we can make sure that in 2030 we're as healthy as we want to be? One area is making sure that this facility is as useful as it can be, not only for us, but also for our community, for community partners that we work regularly with, but also we would love to be a place that can host more gatherings for our community. Our building gets used a lot, and we are thankful for that and always looking for other ways that our building can be used. Some of this will be finance and trustees working, renewing our master planning process, which began before the pandemic. But the pandemic put a great pause on it. And so Adam Broom is the chair of our trustees, and trustees has commissioned Jan Sassaman to be working as a point person for this master planning process and its work with the finance committee as well. And so over the year, really after the midpoint of the year, you'll begin to hear more about that process and what we're thinking about, ways to maximize this facility, ways to expand on work and opportunities at the Umstead property and real clarity around that, and then other opportunities as we move forward. Y'all know that it's been quite some time since we've done any major renovations of our properties, and I tell you, every time a boiler goes out, I just think there's one day it's gonna quit for good. And so we've just got to be thinking ahead, not only about those kinds of infrastructure issues, but how can our building and any property that the church owns be most flexible and usable, not only for our purposes, but for the purposes of people in our community that we partner with as well. So that's going to be one of the things we are working on. We also are trying to, in the discipleship commission, really rethink how we have fun together. Now, over the years of my time here at University Church, which is, if you combine everything together, a little over 8.5 years, I've been around this community between the two iterations. I've heard all kinds of stories about things that we used to do together. Well, we think it's about time that we had more fun together, more gatherings where people can come, can mix together and enjoy life. So one early expression of this was what Pastor Jameson and the Discipleship Commission called an adult night out. And really what this was is people, if they had kids, dropped them off here. They were taken care of with Rebecca and the children's team. And then adults went across the street and just hung out together and had a great time of fellowship. And we hope to do more of that so that people can really get to know one another, particularly after the pandemic, when so many families joined us across the pandemic and are still really meeting other people in the life of our church. And so we hope to have more of that. We call these port of entry events, where if you're trying to get involved with the church, you're trying to connect, here's an experience that's not a Sunday school class or not even a service opportunity, where you can come and just really socialize. So we hope to have more of those as time goes on. It's also a less intimidating environment to invite a friend to. Let's having a meal together and inviting somebody to a meal is a little bit easier than inviting somebody to Sunday school sometimes. So, these kinds of activities. But we also hope to leverage the opportunities that are being made between our family of churches to include a broader diversity of people. So this is one of the things that our church cares about. And one of the easiest ways to do this is to create diverse experiences for people to be a part of. And so when you look at the culture and character of, let's just talk about worshiping life. Worshiping life in this campus, in this sanctuary, as in compared to worshiping life at the AMC with the Kindred campus. And then when you go to the Amity campus or Amity Charge, you see these different cultures represented in the different places. And so we're asking these questions about, okay, so what demographics of people do each of these cultures reach well, and how can we accentuate that? So how can we look at each of these various expressions in our family of churches as growing expressions and reaching people? And then we've got to continue to ask that question, so who's left out from our family that we want to be a part of our family? And then we find ways to leverage our facilities or leverage the gifts of our staff to increase that circle of kinship that we like to talk about. And so all of those things we believe are really necessary as we look toward 2030 to say, how can we be healthy and growing? Let's think about our spaces and how we use them well and how we include people well in those spaces. Let's think about how we gather together as a family and how we invite others to gather with us. And let's think about who's here, but also who's not here, and be really serious about connecting with people who aren't here. Now this, I really feel very passionately about that third piece, because it is what it's what drives me at the end of the day. So I spend a lot of time thinking about who is here and the needs of the people who are here. I spend a lot of time, because it's the people who are here who talk to me. The people who are not don't, right? But for any church, we've got to be passionate about saying who's not here that we want to be here. And then at the end of the day, we make our decisions on what we do and how we operate directed toward them. So if we realize, I'm making things up. This is not part of a conversation that we've had. But if we said that we felt a calling in the life of this church to reach people who were coming to the campus community, be they professors or students, and who were students from other countries or immigrants from other countries. I mean, if that's the calling, if that's who you want to include, then you've got to figure out how to marshal your resources to reach those folks. So he's thinking through, how do we staff? How do we program? How do we organize our life of worship? All of that to reach who you want to reach. And you might even make sacrifices of what you prefer in order to reach who you want to reach. And so, again, I was just pulling something out of the air, but it's something that we can all kind of wrap our minds around, right? You know, if I want to reach someone, what am I going to do to be able to make that possible? And so we've always got to be asking that question in the life of our church, and we'll continue to ask that question in the life of our church council. But it's not just the life of the church council, it's the life of our congregation as we listen to each and every one of you talk about, so who do we want to be in the pews here, and at the Kindred campus, and at the Amity campus? Who do we feel like we should be reaching? Okay, good. Now let's get out there and do that. So we'll be doing a lot of that in our church council, and hopefully a lot of that in the life of our congregation. We see beautiful examples of that at our Kindred campus. When we talk about what we wanted to do in the early days and who Kindred is reaching, it's almost an exact match. It's good. It's good. And so we hope to do more of that across all of our family of churches as well. All right, so those are the highlight reel. Any questions from any of that before Pastor Jameson closes us out? That's good. I'm glad to have the part with less questions.
What you don't realize is we alternate every time. So you will get the finances next week, and I'll talk about all the fun stuff. No, yes, Bob.
A lot of you know me. I'm Bob Lohman. I've been in the church for 30 plus years, and most of my friends are 70 years old and older. And I talk to a lot of them, and I've been hearing some things about dissatisfaction. You brought up this question of dissatisfaction. And one of the things that people have been saying to me is, well, we've got all these kids in the church the first of the month, and they move around a lot, and they make noise, and it's disruptive, and I can't worship. And I've noticed that a lot of older folks aren't coming the first Sunday of the month. And I just want to challenge people of my generation. We're not the future of the church. We give most of the money. I chaired the finance committee for years. I know that older folks are the folks who give most of the money. That's true. But we're not the future of the church. And when I came this morning, when I came 1st of February, and I just saw the energy level of the families. Yeah, some of the kids are squirrely. Some of them are disruptive. There's no question about it. But wow, the energy level was so incredible, and they were so involved in what was going on. I just want to challenge people of my generation that we need to revise how we think church ought to look like and what kind of decorum there ought to be all the time, and welcome those kids and welcome those families, because that is the future of this church. I'm absolutely convinced of it. And I have to get used to it too. It is a little disruptive. There's that constant noise undercurrent throughout the whole service. But wow, the energy was fantastic, and I just loved it.
All right. And I will say in all of that, thank you, Bob, so much for sharing, is that we are very careful in how we say, yes, we are excited about what we're doing, but we also want to do it with the heart of everyone is part of the family. And so I think that it can be a false binary to think that just because something's exciting, and I appreciate that challenge to come, please contact us, and we want to be in conversation with you, because how you feel matters to us. We never want to be a shut up and get on board church, because what I've realized in that is that sounds real good at 36, But I've heard this, I won't be 36 forever. And so while it may be fun to have that now, I know that eventually I'll be called and stretched in ways. And I just wanted us to say we're all in this together as a family. I really value and appreciate that. And to that end, that really ties into what the town hall is. So we went a lot more, probably more depth. And some of you are either thinking too much depth, or some of you are thinking too little depth. And then for those that are too little depth, let's talk to you about the finance committee. But the financial part will probably always be a part of this, especially given the year and what we're tackling. It'll be a more consolidated part, but what we hope to always do is have town halls where we give you clear information on where we're at, and then we share things going on in the life of the church across the board. So if I could give one final, because this question was actually asked at church council, and I wish I would have remembered that when I was up here talking. Someone asked, like, do we need to hit the panic button? Is the sky falling? Is Chicken Little about to bust through the door and come in here? The answer is no. The church is still doing wonderful things. The church is still in a place of financial integrity, even if it isn't our strongest point. But what I would say is we're taking it seriously and we're actively working on it, and we want to engage in a way that allows our generosity to match our hopes and our dreams for the year. So I hope you hear that. Don't panic, but also know that we're taking it seriously. And that's why we want to talk about this. And so going forward, we're going to have 2 more town halls. The next is April 30th. You don't have to write that down because you'll get another email and update. By then, we'll be able to have more financial analysis. We're getting close to the end of our fiscal year, have some conversations around that. But that will allow us to make a final push in the last 2 months to figure it out. And then we'll be back in the fall, either in September or October, whatever date fits best for the purposes. I do realize that during the summer, a lot of us are traveling and whatnot, so we'll probably be looking at that September, October date. And again, give us feedback. Let us know how helpful this was, things that could be added, further questions you have. This is not the end-all, be-all conversation. In fact, sometimes, if rightly used, this could spur on questions you didn't even know that you had, and we want to be able to answer those and get connected. So thank you so much for your time. I am realizing, though, that in all my preparation to be Mike, I did not ask the person who I was thinking would close us in prayer to close us in prayer. So Pastor Lindsay, would you like to come close us in prayer? This is not hazing of the wonderful person that's on staff, because she's got more experience than me. But anyways.
Let us pray. Hi, God. God, we're excited about the things that you are doing in our midst. We're challenged by some of it, but we are also excited every time we feel the Holy Spirit move amongst us. God, help us to listen to the ways that you are calling us to reach out to our community, to get to know those around us, to really see people in the way that you see them. God, give us an eye and a vision for this place. Call us into your work that we might not build kingdoms of our own, but we might build your kingdom, a kingdom of love and light. And Lord, lead on. We ask these things in the strong name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.